Good morning and welcome back to our second day of BX16. I take it as a good sign that so many of you came back. As you know, we do care about behavior, so voting with your feet is important. I hope you had an inspiring day, an interesting day yesterday. I certainly did, and have many takeaways from many different sessions. Today, we'll be moving more into implementation, into applications in different parts of the world, in different organizations, governmental organizations, NGOs, really around the globe. So it should be super interesting. And then we'll end the day today by stretching our minds a little bit and asking the question of what's next. So where's kind of the field going? What are some of the very big questions? Well, let me reflect for a moment on yesterday, on some of the insights that I think transpired in various different sessions. One of them was that we're moving beyond what works. We're moving beyond understanding how to nudge people or how to promote behavior change, although that's still a very important topic for us, clearly. And we might want to call this a psychology of nudging. So what kind of nudge works under what kind of circumstances? And I think that's going to be with us as long as we exist as behavioral scientists. But I saw a few additional themes emerge yesterday. And one of them was the sustainability of nudging. That sometimes we want to nudge for tomorrow, but more often than not, we want to nudge for eternity. And I think that's a big question for us collectively to think about which nudges are actually able to promote sustainable behavior change. So I think that was a big theme that really ran through many of the sessions yesterday. A second big theme was to better understand the context of nudging. So under what circumstances are these behavioral types of interventions particularly useful? Is it in circumstances, for example, where we have little power over the organizations or the people who we want to nudge? But people also thought about the right timing of nudges. So should we nudge at the first day of the month when we know behavior change is more likely, the first day of the week, the first day of the year? So this was in the health session, so really interesting insights there. So the timing was a second kind of concern of ours. And then thirdly, people started to wonder about the relative effectiveness of nudges compared to other kinds of interventions that we could think about. And the second bucket, kind of in contrast maybe to the first one, which is focusing on the how, the second bucket might be closer to the economics of nudging. Now really starting to think about what are the benefits and costs of nudges, what are the comparative advantage of a nudge compared to regulation or a law or an incentive. And some of you have started to look at cost effectiveness. So if you had $1 to spend to promote health behavior or to get more kids to school, what should we spend the dollar on? And then thirdly, and I think that's kind of where some of the boundaries really are right now, because these are really big questions and important questions, but close to the heart in particular of an economist, are questions around welfare. So we're not just promoting behavior change, but we are doing something bigger. What is the bigger impact of the change that we are promoting? How does it actually affect people's welfare or society's welfare? And of course, that itself is a behavioral question because of the debate around how we measure welfare to start with. So these are kind of three, I think, of the burning issues at the moment, kind of in addition to the how, just really thinking about kind of context and also cost effectiveness and welfare. So today, we want to shift the discussion and really hear from the decision makers who, some of them are also producers of research, of course, so that boundary is really blurry, but are also implementers and change makers in the real world outside of academia. And I think the fun part about our field of behavioral science is that much is co-production. That a lot of what we do, we academics, we do jointly with the practitioners and vice versa, and it's a back and forth. I think that makes our product so much better. So I'm super excited about the panel that we have this morning, and I'm going to introduce our moderator in just a second. But I wanted to quickly preview the day today, give you a sense of where we're going, and also, in fact, reflect a little bit on the format yesterday. You might have noted that a little bit of design also went in yesterday's day. And there's two things that we thought about. The first one was long breaks to encourage interactions and also to encourage participation in the sessions. And I think the weather wasn't completely collaborating there. So that I think was one thing that we were quite happy with, that many of you in fact talked to people that you hadn't talked with beforehand. And the other design element on which we're still collecting data, and this is of course very scientific, is the preview of these breakout sessions. Because when we thought about the previews of the breakout sessions, of course we had two things in mind. One was information sharing is good. Secondly, information sharing is bad because you'll all be in the lost domain for the rest of the day. Because now you're all thinking about all the great sessions that you're not part of. And it seems like most of you didn't feel extremely loss averse yesterday, but again, this is not a scientific experiment. The people who talk to us kind of like the previews here. And you can, of course, watch the breakouts, those sessions that you weren't able to attend after the conference. But in any case, any feedback that you have on some of these format questions and some of these previews, whether that was useful or not, we'd love to hear them. Today, we're doing a bit more of a standard format where we don't do previews of breakout sessions, just because we're hedging our bets. So we're going to do one day a bit more risky and then the other day a bit more traditional. But today, we'll go directly into your breakout. So we'll have the panel now, then you'll have a break. Then we'll go into the breakout sessions, the ones that you signed up for. Then we'll have lunch, and then we'll tell you more about the afternoon. But we'll have more breakout sessions in the afternoon, and at the end, another panel discussions thinking about kind of the future of our field. And with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our moderator today, who joined us specifically for this session because it's actually very close to his heart, because he has been living at the intersection of academia and practice really all his life. And this is the Dean of the Kennedy School, Doug Elmendorf. So thank you very much, Doug, for being here. Doug is an economist, and he joined the Kennedy School from the Congressional Budget Office, where he was the director for 7 or 8 years. But Doug has really been a spanner. He's worked for Brookings, he's been on the faculty at Harvard University, he's worked for the Council of Economic Advisors, he's worked for the Treasury, for the Federal Reserve Bank. So lots of areas where we have a very close link between academia and practice. And thus we're super delighted, Doug, that you're here to have with us this discussion, which is so close to all of our hearts. Doug Elmendorf, thank you very much.
Thank you, Iris. I'm delighted to be here. One of the great rewards for me as Dean of the Kennedy School is having a chance to participate, at least a little, in the fascinating work of my colleagues. And some of the most fascinating work underway at the Kennedy School right now is the work of the Behavioral Insights group. The intellectual appeal of the work and the importance of the work for effective governance can hardly be overstated. So I'm very pleased to have been invited to join you this morning. This session on implementing behavioral insights has a terrific panel consisting of Varun Gauri and Henriette Prast and David Halpern and Bill Congdon. Because you are here to hear from them, not from me, I will keep my introductions of them very brief. Then they will each have a chance to talk for 10 minutes. About their perspectives, and then you and I will have a chance to ask them questions. So let me introduce them, and I think they can come up and sit here. Is that your idea for this while the conversation goes on, or do you want to let people sit in their seats?
During the presentations, they can stay
here so you can watch more easily. Okay, terrific. Let me introduce them. So Varun Gauri leads the Global Insights Initiative at the World Bank, where he is a senior economist in the Development Research Group. He was co-director of last year's World Development Report on Mind, Society, and Behavior. He's written many articles and book chapters in books. His current research addresses 3 themes. One, of course, is how to use behavioral insights to enhance development policy. One is when public agencies comply with human rights orders. And one is why individuals support public goods. So a trio of important issues. David Halpern is Chief Executive of the Behavioral Insights team in the United Kingdom. This team started in 10 Downing Street in 2010. David has led the team since its inception. Of course, it is widely acknowledged as a leader in integrating behavioral insights and experimentation in government. I'm told that every citizen of the UK has now been on the receiving end of a BIT-inspired interaction. David's written a number of books, including last year's Inside the Nudge Unit. Henriette Prast is professor of finance at the School of Economics and Management at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. She's also a member of the Dutch Senate. Previously, she held positions at the Dutch Central Bank and the Dutch Scientific Council for Government Policy. She's been instrumental in bringing behavioral science into both academia and the government in the Netherlands. And Bill Congdon is a fellow on the Social and Behavioral Sciences team at the White House. This team is a cross-agency group that translates findings from behavioral science into improvements in federal programs and policies. I met Bill a number of years ago when we were both at Brookings. He is an economist who focuses on how to use behavioral insights to improve policies regarding healthcare, taxes, and labor markets. So with that brief start, let me turn this over in turn to each one of the four panelists. And then, as I said, we'll have a chance to ask questions at the end. Varun, it's all yours. Thank you.
Is this working? Yes. Thanks so much, Doug. Thank you to Iris and Max and Abby and the Behavioral Insights Group for the opportunity to be here and discuss the work of the World Bank in this area. What I want to do in the next few minutes is to describe where we are. We're relatively new in terms of behavioral insights and the use of behavioral insights at the World Bank. And then say a couple of words about a topic that I think is crucial for development, which is the use of behavioral insights for governance, or nudging the nudgers, as I like to say. The World Bank has perhaps, among the various agencies that have begun to use behavioral insights, the highest share of social scientists among its staff, mostly economists, but also political scientists, anthropologists, a variety of other actors. That's an opportunity, because behavioral insights is grounded in rigorous social science, but at the same time, it's a challenge because people have ways of thinking already ingrained. And one of the challenges that we have is to overcome those and begin to bring this way of thinking into the mainstream of the institution. Another way of saying that is that there were already some activities related to behavioral insights at the World Bank when many of us began this initiative. There was a long tradition in development about social marketing. The general idea of behavior change through public-private partnerships was very active throughout the development community, but also at the World Bank on topics like breastfeeding, hand washing, sanitation, condom use, a variety of topics like that. That community uses the insights, the intuitions from behavioral economics, but without necessarily the science that has emerged in the last couple of decades. That's a community that had been active and that this community needs to work with and bring on board. Another antecedent was the work on participation and transparency. And I'll say a couple more words about this later when I talk about nudging the nudgers, but the key idea here is that when you make salient the activities of government, you're making things, that's transparency, that also has an impact. And there was a lot of work on this in the 2000s related to service delivery. That's a community that was also very active. There were some behavioral economics pilots in recent years. In the area of taxes, in the area of water conservation. And there was research. The research group to which I belong many of my colleagues did some interesting work on commitment devices, on soap operas, and the impact of soap operas on saving The Impact Evaluation Group, DIME, was also very active in this area as well. So there were a number of things going on over the past several years. In 2015, we wrote the World Development Report to Mind, Society, and Behavior. Our main message was that development policy is due for a redesign based on a more realistic understanding of how human beings think, decide, and behave. That's, I think, uncontroversial in this audience. The report was strongly endorsed by senior management and gave an impetus to the work that many of us were already engaged in. So now we have a multiple number of initiatives in the institution. It's a very decentralized place where a policy entrepreneur can pick up an idea and run with it. We have the Global Insights Initiative, which sits in the Office of the Chief Economist. The Poverty Global Practice has a behavioral initiative. The Social Protection and Labor Team has a number of initiatives related to socio-emotional skills. The Behavior Change Community of Practice, as I mentioned, is very active. A number of other teams in taxes, household finance, gender, social development are working, and of course, the researchers are also working in this area. There are dozens of projects. A couple of these, a handful of these focus on tax compliance in the spirit of the work of the Behavioral Insights team. We have some work on increasing the use of public and private toilets in India. As many of you know, the government of India has set a target of zero open defecation in 2019. Previous work has shown us that it's not enough to build toilets. We have to change behavior and get people to use them. We're working with the government in a couple of initiatives there. The Consultative Group to Assist the Poor has been working on digital financial services for some time. We're collaborating with them to use digital financial services as a platform to increase savings and insurance take-up in Tanzania. We're interested in road safety in India. The next panel, make a plug for it, we'll address that. We have a couple projects to reduce dropouts among marginalized students in different countries, lower personal bankruptcy rates in Malaysia, help female Syrian refugees enter labor markets. The key idea there is that Syrian refugees are going to be refugees for quite some time, and we might as well try to make that a life and give people the opportunity to work, and particularly women. And finally, there are a number of programs to upgrade the skills of job seekers. The team in the Social Protection and Labor Global Practice has a couple interesting projects related to socio-emotional skills and behavioral nudges. One focuses on helping job seekers in Turkey. In one treatment, there's a self-efficacy, some work related to self-efficacy, socio-emotional skills, and salience of their own activities. In another treatment, it's that plus adding information about labor markets and about the support that's available to job seekers. There's another initiative to teach grit in Macedonia's middle schools. This is with Angela Duckworth and her lab. The two treatments involve delivering a curriculum to students on the one hand, and the other hand, training teachers to reinforce that curriculum. So that's where we are. We're relatively new in terms of these initiatives, just a handful of years old, really, in terms of a concerted effort. So what does the near future hold? In the near future, what we expect is a series of impact evaluations about the efficacy and effectiveness of the use of behavioral insights, or in other words, great success, fame, budget codes, promotions, all of that good stuff. But to do that, we'll have to overcome some challenges. These are some of the main challenges that we face. The first is a certain kind of distance from the front lines. The World Bank team works with governments, usually central governments, who then work with local governments who are working with beneficiaries. So because the use of behavioral insights, or perhaps the key idea in behavioral insights is that decision-making is contextual. So you have to understand the context for decision-making. We're a couple steps removed. That creates challenges. They can be overcome through spending time in the field, ethnography, focus groups, surveys, A/B testing. There's lots of ways to get there, but it's a challenge. It's also the case, as I mentioned, that although certain teams are used to this direct engagement with beneficiaries and understanding the context, people, for instance, who work on poverty or health often talk to beneficiaries, but there are other disciplines for whom that's not common. That's a challenge to be overcome. A second is that the World Bank is a bank, and ask yourself, would you borrow to be nudged and evaluated? I'm not sure that many of you would, and countries are often in the same position. There's a mental model of what borrowing is for. It's for typically investment projects, roads, electricity, things like that. we have moved on, and now people borrow for human capital investments, for macroeconomic stabilization. But the idea of borrowing to be nudged, particularly when nudges are supposed to be inexpensive, is something we need to get around. So often these are sort of add-ons to projects. And of course, evaluation is a public good. So no one country is going to be necessarily willing to borrow for goods that will benefit the whole world. Hybrid projects are another challenge. And my colleague, Omar Arias, made this point. And Omar and his team, by the way, are here if you want to hear more about the Turkey and Macedonia projects. They're out in the audience somewhere. The key problem here is that often what we're trying to do is improve development outcomes. And we don't necessarily have just one clean channel rooted in behavioral insights, but these are overlaid with incentives or other kinds of things. In the context of socio-emotional skills, the issue is that we want to, say, improve the locus of self-control, change the model of the locus of control, but also provide information about labor market outcomes, which we know can improve educational decision making. Sometimes we put those together. In the context of toilets in India, in the past, people have subsidized toilet construction, but those toilets haven't been used because of the absence of a social norm. On the other hand, how do you create a social norm without actually having toilets to use? So you kind of need to do this stuff together, and that creates a challenge. You don't get a clean identification of the contribution of behavioral insights, but sort of a net effect. And then finally, there's a criticism involving small interventions and big needs. And this comes from a lot of people working in development. Countries are have tremendous problems, and nudging looks small. What do we make of that? How do we answer that challenge? And on that last point, let me turn to nudging the nudgers. Governance really is the core bottleneck in development. A number of people have made this point. I think there's consensus on this now. In the context of behavioral economics, of course, to implement behavioral insights, you need trained talent. You need to recruit and train a bureaucracy. You need capacity for impact evaluation. You need political mobilization, collective action on the part of citizens to hold governments accountable. You can't take that for granted. Even something like the classic nudge, which is opt-out retirement savings, you need a substantial regulatory, financial, informational infrastructure for that to work. You can't assume that that's operative in developing countries. So we need to address governance, and behavioral insights can help in a number of ways. Productivity and effort, impartiality and objectivity, transparency and accountability. I'll say a couple words about these. I've been very happy to see that that this work is emerging. More of this work is going on, particularly some of Iris's work on the effectiveness of teams. There were a couple of conversations. There's the session on organizational behavior yesterday. But I think we need much more work in this area. On productivity and effort, what we know is that unexpected rewards can be motivating. Some work from Hussein and List shows that at a Chinese factory, a one-time bonus of 20% of weekly wages increased productivity by 2 or 3%, even when it was not conditional on anything. It was just as effective as making a bonus conditional. So surprises, that motivates people. Social recognition matters. Many of you know the work of Nava Ashraf, who shows that with hairdressers in Zambia who are selling female condoms, social recognition was more effective than large commissions on the sale of those female condoms. Then proximity and peer effects matter a lot too. We know that who you're sitting next to motivates you from work on that Masa Moretti did in a supermarket chain. There's also work from Tanzania that shows that when doctors just call a peer and say, hey, did you do something? The clinical quality improves. People respond to their peers. We have a small little experiment, which is very early in Nigeria, in which we're looking at the question of expenditure tracking. We're trying to improve making sure to track resources, which is related to leakage, of course. And in a couple of states, with the World Bank team, we've implemented stars in the manner of the Zambia experiment, and find that in this short little experiment in a few weeks, this increases the effectiveness of overall tracking resources and motivates the bureaucracy. We did not find significance in another state, and so we'll look more into that. Another area is objectivity and impartiality. Objectivity and impartiality are part of the UK Civil Service Code 4 core values. They're part of the UN Standards of Conduct, and in an important definition of the quality of government, includes impartial institutions. So the idea here is that we need people to behave more like Weberian bureaucrats. Can we nudge that? Is there anything we can do to motivate people to pay attention to the obligations of their office as opposed to the obligations of kin, connection, political party, something like that? It's a huge challenge. I would love to see more work on it. For us, this grew out of some work that was in the World Development Report, in which we looked at the ideological biases of World Bank staff, gave World Bank staff a 2x2 table, and asked them to interpret it in with two frames. This is borrowing from work from Dan Kahan, one involving skin cream and rash, the other on whether the minimum wages impact the incomes of the poor, and found that bank staff are more likely to get the answer right in the skin cream framing than in the minimum wage framing. So there's a sense that one's worldview affects how you interpret data, and we need to find ways to help people become more objective and impartial. Finally, transparency and accountability. This is the last thing I'll say. I think one way to think about this is that there are shrouded political attributes. The idea of shrouded attributes is common in economics. The key idea is that you're buying a printer, but you don't think about the ink jet, the cost of the cartridges. Or when you're signing up for a contract, there are fees that are hidden. My favorite example is from Seinfeld, when Jerry and George go to buy a car. The guy selling the car says, "Here's the price." "Oh, but there's this," and they say, "What's that?" And then the car dealer says, "Oh, it's the surcharge, double charge, and extra charge." And George and Jerry say, "Oh, yeah, this surcharge, double charge, extra charge." They sort of knew it was there, but didn't focus on it. The same way that there are shrouded economic attributes, there are shrouded political attributes. You know that people are not big, or teachers are absent. You know that there's leakage, but you don't quite focus on it until you get that number put in front of you, or people pay attention to it. That's the idea of transparency. We know from research that transparency, in an important paper in 2000, increased the resources reaching Ugandan schools. Recently, Banerjee and others find that it improves the targeting of rice subsidies in Indonesia, but it didn't reduce that teacher absenteeism or the right to work program in India. So when does transparency work? When does it not work? In recent work, Cass Sunstein includes the whole transparency agenda about firms and their carbon emissions, all this as part of nudging. I think that's right, but when does it work? One way to think about it is that it requires the right political incentives, which in turn requires citizen collective action. My colleague Stuti Kamani has a report which makes this argument recently, but I would love to see more work on this topic. So just to sum up, we are expecting big things at the World Bank. Stay tuned, and we'll have even bigger things if all of you help us work on nudging the nudgers. Thank you.
So thanks to Abby and Max and Iris and everyone for having us here. As you have no doubt noticed, I am not Maya Shankar, as is listed in your conference agenda. Maya was called to New York this week to brief the UN Secretary General on work that she's doing with behavioral insights at the UN. She sends her regards and her regrets for not being able to make it. I am Bill Congdon. As Doug said, I'm a fellow on the social and behavioral sciences team and an economist there. I've been there working with Maya since near to the beginning. And so I will give a stand-in version of the talk that's sort of an update, a quick update on where SBST is, where we're going, some of the challenges that we've been seeing. I will be, for those of you who know Maya, be giving a version of this talk that's approximately 30% less energetic than Maya would give. I hope it will be as fully insightful. So to start with just a quick update on the evolution of the team itself. Think back to the mists of time in 2013. This is when Maya came to DC and started working on this, and it was really a blank slate. The idea for a team like this had been around for a long time. It goes back to Dick Thaler and others. But when we started out, there was no mandate for this. There was no budget line, no authority to do this type of work, and no real high-level buy-in for it. Fast forward to now, and we have a growing cross-agency federal body that's working in support of a behavioral insights agenda that's defined by an executive order. The cross-agency body, the Social and Behavioral Sciences team, includes behavioral scientists, economists, psychologists, as well as policy and program staff across the federal government. It's led by Maya out of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, but it includes members out at agencies across the government at places including Department of Labor, Social Security, Department of Defense, Department of Treasury. As well as other offices in the White House. So the National Economic Council, Domestic Policy Council, places like that. And as Doug mentioned in the introduction, we think of our mission as one that's fundamentally translational, sort of from research insights in the behavioral sciences into improvements in federal policies and programs. As articulated in the executive order, we do this by providing advice and guidance to agencies on identifying applications of behavioral insights, developing strategies for implementing those changes, and where possible, testing for their impact, helping them to identify how to recruit behavioral scientists into government, and strengthening agency relationships with the research community, so many of the type of folks in this room. Okay, so we have assembled this team in DC. What have we been doing with it? A little less than a year ago, we released our first what we intend to be annual reports. This included results from a dozen or so behavioral insights trials. And it was what we described at the time as a report of sort of proof of concept projects. And I think that seems basically right, and a point that I'll return to in a moment. To give an example of the type of project included in this report, this is a project related to participation rates in the Thrift Savings Plan, which is sort of the federal government's 401k among military service members. This was an email outreach campaign testing, I believe, 7 different treatment arms of emails against a control, including behavioral insights related to framing this as a yes or no choice, using fresh start messaging. Katie Milkman helped collaborate on this project. And it was to good effect. We saw an increase in the month after sending this email of about 5,000 enrollments and the equivalent of about $1 million+ in additional savings. And based on this work, the Department of Defense sort of continues to use this type of outreach and communication. So, as I said, this project is illustrative of the sort of proof of concept type work. It's illustrative of also a framework that we've used in the past to help identify behavioral insights projects and structure behavioral insights projects in the federal government. And it's this sort of set of 3 pieces that I think we discussed very early on at the Behavioral Insights Group conference in 2014, actually. And what we mentioned there is that, and I think this has been true in our experience, the proof of concept projects, the quick wins, have tended to start here. So finding an email system that's ready to send out those types of communications, finding letters that are sort of on their way out, finding websites that we can redesign, and then incorporating behavioral science insights to sort of leverage the behaviors that are related to the program and policy goals. So in the case of the Thrift Savings Plan email work, the goal here is the financial security of military service members. The behavior we're trying to influence in support of that is participating in saving through this savings plan. And the touch point is the email. The framework here also, I think, helps us to pivot and think about some of the challenges and thinking about what to do next with the social and behavioral sciences team, where I think the fundamental challenge we face is having assembled the team, having demonstrated that it can get things done in the federal government. How do we now use that to the greatest effect? How do we have the biggest contributions to social welfare? This is fundamentally a question about sort of what to work on, and that means in many more cases now, starting with the policy goals. What are the social goals we're trying to advance? What are the policy problems we're trying to solve? The market failures we're trying to correct? And then from that, thinking about how does behavior influence those outcomes? What are the policy levers we have to influence those behaviors? So how are we going to do this? It forces us to think a little bit more about, in particular, how to think about what sort of policy goals, what sort of policy challenges are related to behavior in particular, and sort of what the policy tools are at our disposal and how to think about changing them. We think we have some help in our instance that we're building from based on the executive order. This provides a light framework here for thinking about, on the one hand, this issue of thinking about what policy problems are sort of fundamentally behavioral. In the 4 categories it outlines where we're thinking about access to programs. So if the policy challenge at hand is addressing poverty and inequality, and we're thinking about a program like the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is one of the sort of largest poverty-reducing efforts in the United States, having that program be successful will depend on whether people are able to access that program. Currently, about 3.5 million people each year who look like they're eligible for that program don't take it up. And so that's the sort of problem we're working on right now. Similarly, how we present information, structuring choices in programs like health insurance programs where individuals are faced with a choice across health insurance plans. How do we help those make those choices? How do we use financial and non-financial incentives to address program goals? Finally, let me talk about, I think, 2 examples of threads of work that we're undertaking right now that exemplify how we're thinking about these challenges. The first is building on the work related to retirement security with the military. So this is building on the email outreach work. We also reported last year the results of on-base interventions that sort of prompted yes or no choices on a pilot basis. We saw promising results from those efforts. This year, we are working on a handful of military bases implementing a sort of true active choice intervention. So this is sort of requiring a yes or no enrollment decision from service members at this point. And in sort of preliminary results, we're seeing very promising sort of large impacts, double-digit impacts on the enrollment rates. Based on that work, based on the previous work doing email work, my colleagues on the team who've been doing this have also been advising on the implementation of the Defense Reauthorization Act, which will now begin to automatically enroll new service members in the TSP. It illustrates, I think, nicely, first, that we have a spectrum of sort of policy interventions and policy tools, policy levers to work with, and that working across that spectrum, it's not a matter of abandoning the email work, abandoning the sort of those types of efforts. It's a matter of building on them, and in fact, that work is cumulative. One last example, very briefly, is work related to returning to work among the uninsured. And this is another place where we start with the policy challenge of seeing individuals who they're out of work, we want to help them get back. We have a range of projects going on right now, working on everything from the communications to individuals who are out of work, helping to prime positive identities, to help them make plans to get back to work. But in addition to that, we're also working to develop a proposal in one state that would actually change the way in which the unemployment benefits themselves are dispersed. So rather than a sort of level monthly amount of benefits, the benefits would be initially higher and then at some point reduced to a lower level. And based on work that researchers have done suggesting that individuals might have reference sort of dependent preferences over those benefits, we expect that there's a chance that that will help individuals sort of motivate their return to work. This is, again, an example of thinking about not taking the policy environment as fixed, of thinking about the sort of full spectrum of policy tools at our disposal. It's also a case where I think going in this direction, thinking about policy design more seriously, the work has to really continue to reflect the marriage of psychology and economics as we start to think about taking the policy environment as not being fixed. We have to start thinking seriously about issues like market failure in the context of unemployment insurance. To think about the right way to do this, it has to be in the context of a model where we're trading off consumption smoothing against the potential for moral hazard. And so this type of work, I think, will end up being a richer basis for future policy design efforts. I think I'll stop there.
Mom? Very good. Thanks. Hi. It's really great to be here. Actually, it's one of the wonderful things about working in an area for a while is you do actually get to know everyone, a lot of people, and it's really nice to see you guys as colleagues and friends here in Boston. What I thought I'd do is give you a very quick update of what we've been up to, particularly in the last year in the UK, and see how we do. It's been exciting. Okay. Just to remind you, those who don't know, who haven't, I think you all know, we kind of got set up in 2010, and then coalition government with this idea of finding ways to support and encourage people to make better choices for themselves, that being our mantra. Of course, we now have the Prime Minister was re-elected, no longer as a coalition government, but as a Conservative central-right administration. This, by the way, was at the end of BX from last year, for those who were there. We actually, the first time we kind of ever had everyone in the BIT team in one place, and we got them all together, and we realized, like, geez, we're not a team of 7 people stuck in the back of Downing Street and Cabinet Office anymore. There's really quite a lot of us. Anyway, so for those of you who are still organizing the event, this is how we felt after hours. So encouragement. Okay, obviously we continue to write and talk about what we do inside Nudge Unit out, but also our other material. Hopefully, of course, we'll shortly, Owen, have our new update out, including some of the results, which I'll show you right now. I just wanted to give you a sense that actually the Prime Minister remains as interested as he ever has done. This, in fact, this was just from a speech a few days after the BX event on his vision for a smarter state. The latest thinking in behavioral science should be used. We don't do executive orders in quite the same way. We just get up and say, we'll do this thing, and hopefully it happens. But also, this is just stuff about, actually it is true. This is stuff also from the PM speeches in terms of, we do reference this stuff, and not just we, I mean, he does, our Prime Minister does, on a regular basis. At least it tells you it's worth working with us at the very least, because you can, good chance that you'll get a quote from the Prime Minister you can put on the back of your subsequent work. And this is from the Life Chancellor speech earlier this year. I mean, again and again, he's repeating this point. This is from a really interesting bit of work in the speech we're doing on prison reform, about being really creative and much more open to new thinking, the new technology, and the understanding from behavioral insights. So we don't have to prompt him anymore. He's talking about it, he's thinking about it, our cabinet are on a regular basis. And that's a wonderful place to be and an encouragement for those of you who may be earlier on this road. I thought I'd just show you a couple of results that came out in the last year, and also one I just literally got this morning. I managed to extract from one from Michael standards. This is some work, because often our business is to not just nudge nudges or the population, but professional groups is an absolutely key issue. We found in the UK it's quite hard to nudge GPs and doctors in general, certainly without major political wrangles. But this is an interesting intervention on a big issue, antimicrobial resistance. We simply prescribe too many antibiotics. Published in The Lancet. But I'll show you two trials. First of all, I'm going to show you something else, which is that the department obviously knows it's a very big issue and set aside about $30 million to run a big campaign. Fortunately, we managed to persuade them to run it as a randomized controlled trial. So let me just show you the kind of style of this campaign. Yes, we get creative industry in there, nice big posters, a fact about antibiotics you may find hard to swallow to get your attention, a whole load of things. You get big posters, you get sent to GPs, general practitioners. And it's a randomized controlled trial, and it's going to half of the 20% who prescribe the most, right? So they get big posters and small posters. They can stick around their waiting rooms. They get handouts. They get little leaflets telling you about how to treat your infection. They can give to their patients. They get a briefing sheet for GPs and the managers and so on and so on. Well, I'm not going to put the results up because they're really easy to summarize, which is it did absolutely nothing at all. Okay? Obviously, well, we thought, well, we'll have a go at doing something. So I won't put the letter up for those who haven't seen it. We thought we'll just write a letter to these GPs. Again, a randomized controlled trial. So we identified the GPs, the top 20% of the people who prescribe the most. Remember, they might have very sick patients, so we're not going to just tell them, stop doing it. But we just send them a letter, and it basically just tells them this is true. It's a social norm intervention, saying, by the way, you prescribe more than 80% of other GPs. And here's 3 things that you might want to do. Like, if you're going to write a prescription, give them a prescription and say, if you're not feeling better in 2 days' time, then use it, but otherwise don't. Does it make a difference? So here we go. We have to take out seasonal variation. There's our control groups, the other half of this 20% of GPs, and you can see the variation. They get this letter, and I should have said the letter is also signed by our chief medical officer. We thought this would be more effective than having our minister, Sally Davis. Anyway, and here's the results. There's one letter. They get one letter only. And you can see this is a highly significant effect in terms of a reduced prescription rates that they have over the period. Just to make sure, of course, we then send a letter to the other half of GPs who didn't receive it originally. And there we see the reconvergence of their rates. This might look a very big deal, but the department's target for the year was a 1% reduction in prescription rates. This one intervention gets 80% there, just doing this one. And incidentally, since the period, we've seen continued falls. Okay, I just thought one of our favorite studies, also from Michael, the previous one was Michael Hallsworth, this is Michael Sanders, getting merchant bankers, who of course we all love very much, to give a day of their salary. A wonderful result a few years ago, replicated. If they just get a leaflet, an email from the boss, you can see about 5% give a day of their salary, which is quite a lot of money. Getting volunteers to encourage people, you can see it does pretty much nothing. On the other hand, giving a little tub of sweets when they receive it, those who don't remember this result, replicated, very effective. But Michael also tried a further variation this year, which is what happens if you received a personalized email from someone who gave previously, who explains why it is and what they saw as the impact of their giving. What does that do in terms of the percentage who give? There you go, so that's a proportion who receive it. Social networks alive and well. Of course, this is spreading very much beyond the UK now, as you know, as reflected in the 26 countries, I think you said here. And we very much see that ourselves. I just thought I'd show you a couple of results from elsewhere where we're working, including if I can get this to go. Can't get it to go. There we go. One of the results from the US team, I think Elspeth and, where did I just see you guys? Around here somewhere, waving. Okay. Anyway. There you go. There they are. I know I've seen them. One of many fantastic results being done in cities with the support of Bloomberg. This is just one getting people online. They get an extra prompt in Denver. So you either get this little postcard, kind of Golovitz style, or actually here's a variation on it, using a little checklist as well. And would it make a difference in terms of the proportion who then go and do their license renewal online? And there we go. Yes, it does. Hooray. Anyway, it's a very nice study. It's also nice in that you guys also checked what was the impact in terms of, did it increase it in general, but no, in terms of mail on, people doing mail completions is not affected and so on. Very nice, simple result, 7-8% difference, for lots of us are trying to get people online, nice, simple effect. This is a trial, actually, we're doing a lot of stuff with the Australians, and it's wonderful to see lots of Australians here today. This is actually one from the Alfred. In some ways, it's a very simple trial, but I think it also illustrates in lots of ways the power of the approach. So a lot of us were wrestling with the issue of obesity. It's a trial done by, I did see Kirsten, where are you waving around here? Hey, there she is, if you want to know more detail. Part of a series of really elegant trials. This one was just done in the main canteen in the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne. And the idea is, look, you still got the choice. What happens if you just put the red category, the higher sugar drinks, just a little bit harder to get to? They're still there, they're just a bit harder to get to. Does it make a difference? There you go. But what's also elegant about it, they track the sales performance. So the retailer's like, do I really want to do this? Actually, it doesn't affect sales overall. Indeed, you also see quite a significant, not just an uplift in general, but many people shift, they jump over from one category to another, to the most healthy drinks. Here's some results, just literally in this morning. I extracted it. This is a bit of a work done on FE. By way of background, the UK might be quite keen on behavioral science. We're not very good at reading and writing, unfortunately, in general. So I think we have the rare honor of being the only of the OECD countries where our youngest people, are less likely to have good literacy than those currently retiring. So this is an intervention, part of a series, trying to mobilize with Todd Rogers, also here, sending people a prompt, essentially to someone else, to would you help your kid, would you help this young adult if they need some extra help? This incidentally, we just put on here is some of the responses too, which you can see, which is really quite heartwarming in terms of people, yeah, of course, I'd love to help this person. Does it work? Yes, it does. Superb, very nice result, and you'll hear more about this going forward. For study support, just using a mobilization with a text phone, really quite effective as an intervention. Okay, this is attendance, by the way. Also, just out today, I should have put this on, just over 1 minute, which is just literally, we've been waiting for a long time. We did some interventions using text to try and encourage people, using various kind of prompts. We also thought we'd try some further variations with about 16,000 young learners. The first cut on attendance, you can see, as it happens, the work on using grit measure didn't work on attendance. Now, I should say probably that's not a big surprise because it's not really designed to do that. We're yet to see the performance on results. Whereas the value affirmation intervention was significant uplift in terms of attendance rates. Again, we'll look at the actual academic performance going forward. All right, so just really trying to draw it to conclusion. What I'm trying to give you a sense is, in the UK, not only do we do these trials on a regular basis, I mean, to us, it's always been the case, it's informing policy all the time. We're trying to make decisions about policy. We can't always run a trial, and it's very much the case that we see that. So this is just stuff in relation, for example, the PM's recent intervention on life chances, talking about the fact that we're now going to use name-blind applications in many public services and well beyond, including the Apply platform, we hope. In terms of rainy day savings, on the scarcity work, we've all been talking about this for a long time. Actually, we've introduced in the budget really significant changes to drive up rainy day saving for low-income groups. And the fascinating question is, A, can we get these to work, and will they have the downstream consequences we hope? Or, just to give you one more example, in terms of course, character and resilience. We're very, very keen on this. We're going to do a lot more work in the UK on this going forward. See, our sense is that this may well be a lot of the dark matter that helps to explain low levels of social mobility in some groups. And finally, just to make this point, often, including in this event, people talk about nudges. It's all about nudges and so on. For us, it's never been only about a sort of certain narrow definition of nudges. It's always been about trying to introduce a more realistic model of human behavior into whatever policy lever that may take us to. This, incidentally, is the outline cut on the sugar tax, which we have just introduced recently. So we haven't introduced, we've announced we're doing. We're currently consulting on it. You notice a 2 threshold tax in relation to beverages. See our deliberate intent, you can see where it falls into in terms of current drinks that are on the market, is to drive active reformulation, right? We want to see that happen. We want to see restocking. We want to see an effect which moves consumers and other commercial players as well. We're interested in their behavior in order to effect a change. And we're pretty upbeat about the likely scale of the effect going forward. Okay, so in conclusion, I think in the UK, hopefully again encouragement for you guys, we very much moved from what was absolutely a guerrilla operation running around trying to sort of convince a few departments as to whether we could tinker with some small issue, be it organ donation or whatever, on the basis of evidence elsewhere. Hopefully you can see it's no longer a guerrilla operation, it's very much mainstream. We've moved from, albeit important issues like getting people to pay their tax on time, you don't really want to pay your neighbor's tax, you'd rather they pay their own. but to really core wicked issues of policy, including actually core economic issues in terms of think about our central banks, what they're doing in Japan and in the ECB and so on. It's a lot of the classic models don't work. They don't appear to be working. We've got negative interest rates and still people don't want to spend any money. There are quite core issues where we can be doing life chances, etc. Or indeed corruption. Some of you I know will be joining us tomorrow morning for an event discussing this absolutely massive issue with clearly a strong behavioral component. A growing international community, which is absolutely wonderful, and I hope we can continue to do that, to learn from each other as we've been able to do so in the last few years. And the last thing, let me just say, the other thing for us, it was always about, certainly for me personally, was not just introducing a more realistic model of human behavior for policy, but fundamentally also bringing into government a more empirical approach to everything that we do. And this continues to be a major activity. I know, of course, in Canberra now and elsewhere, joining the good fight, which is to create an ever wider set of what we call What Works institutes in new areas such as children at risk, for example, or within the criminal justice system, in terms of retraining all our civil servants in basic methods and in terms of behavioral science, and creating trial advisory panels inside government and very much more things. So we literally, just in conclusion, I'll just tell you this wonderful thing we now have, which is we now live in a world where our ministers really understand what a randomized controlled trial is. And a great illustration was a few months ago, I was having a discussion with one of our cabinet office ministers who was saying, I just realized I have to sign off because we have cabinet government, 10 odd government commitments and policies every single day, right? They come through these boxes and they flow through. And quite often these are characterized by this department says this and this department says this, and we really don't know what's effective. So I'm going to start writing on these on a regular basis. So can we just do this as a randomized controlled trial then, guys? Right? And that is literally happening today in British government. So I know any of you are moving down the same journey, but I'll just give you some encouragement. I think it's been now an irreversible change in UK government, and one which I think we see sweeping across the world, and we look forward to working with you guys in the coming year too. And on to Singapore now, lads. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you, Abby, Iris, Max, for having me. Very proud to be here. This is the title of my presentation. I'm speaking here as an individual, not as a representative of a political party. Just wanted to have that said. This was 2009. I was at the Scientific Council for Government Policy, and I had organized the yearly lecture and invited Richard Thaler, as you can see here. It's in a church, where he said, I'm spreading here the gospel of behavioral economics. So what did my fellow council members say to this? Here were the comments that I got. Didn't Hitler already apply choice architecture? Can we really expect to offer new insights? This cannot be reconciled with parliamentary democracy. It's nothing new. Please stick to communication, and it is manipulation. Well, of all these bullet points, nowadays in the Netherlands, you only hear the last one. Is it manipulation? I think that most of you heard those comments as well. So, not having been able to convince my colleagues, I thought I need to use more weapons of influence, Max. That's what I'm thinking about now. So, we flew in Barry Schwartz, Bob Cialdini, Max, Elder Shafir, David Leibson, who will be here later today, Zvi Bowie, and I was there to present. The room was full of Dutch policymakers, and they were all very enthusiastic. And I think it all started there, so that was 2010. In 2012, the Behavioral Insight Team was established at the Ministry of Infrastructure and Environment, and Odette van der Riet has presented here 2 years ago on how well they are faring nowadays. 2 years later, so 2 years ago, the top management of all ministries decided to set up a Behavioral Insight Network Netherlands, which is chaired by the Ministry of Economics. That same year, the Ministry of Economics said in a letter to Parliament, we see many opportunities, the government, so not just the economics department, many opportunities for applying behavioral insights in policy making. 1 year later, a large institute in the Netherlands for public health decided to fund an exercise lottery, which is a behavioral incentive, commitment incentive, to exercising more, PhD, which I supervise. And over the years, several ministries have established behavioral insight units, perhaps most of them. And finally, put your money where your mouth is. In the government budget for this year, published in September last year, rethinking of policy instruments is important. We should have a realistic perspective on how people behave. Applying behavioral insights can make our policies more efficient and effective. And we investigate how to apply behavioral economics and social psychology. So this really seems like a success story. That's for the government. Now the Authority for Financial Markets. I used to be a non-executive board member there, so I know a little bit about their history. They have now increased over the past years the number of people working on behavioral themes. 2 of them are sitting here in this room. And I think that they can confirm that at the start it was like on Friday afternoon from 3 to 5 you are allowed to do some behavioral stuff. And now there are 10 people or 11 working on it. Not full time, but more than on the Friday afternoon. They are in the process of acquiring knowledge and plan to use that knowledge in interventions. The Tax Authority also has a behavior unit. For some years, they have been here as well. But they are very resistant, not the behavior unit, but the top of the Tax Authority is very resistant to randomized controlled trials, for example, signing at the top instead of signing at the bottom. They say we don't want to treat taxpayers differently. But does the government walk its talk? And I'm not talking here about the authorities, but the government itself. The Authority for Consumers and Markets is independent, but still part of the Ministry of Economics. And this is their mission. We seek to strengthen the position of consumers, making them better informed, thus enabling them to make well-informed decisions. Well, this doesn't sound very behavioral. Huh? This sounds a rational model. Core principle is the sovereignty of individual consumers. This ID dovetails blah, 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 blah. So when I saw this in the evaluation, because at the Senate we get evaluation reports of the authorities, I asked the Ministry of Economics, but how does this fit in with your claim to do behavioral things? Don't you think that their mission should change? And the answer is no, this mission is fine. Does the government walk its talk? I think 2 months ago, an act was passed in the Netherlands to comply with the European Union Tobacco Directive, which mandates a 65% pictorial health warning. But there's no behavioral evidence that this works. On the contrary, it will have either no or a perverse effect, and the latter would be among people with low self-efficacy. They are going to smoke more. Of course, the government says, because I asked them, that it is based on evidence, but when you see the evidence, which is by the World Health Organization, the evidence is like questionnaires where you ask people, do you think this is a threatening picture? And when they say yes, they claim that as evidence that it will work. Another example, the government doesn't do anything to change bad defaults. For example, default for student loans, I will explain it in a moment, and the default of serving meat at government lunches and dinners. There's also good news. There's a proposal now which is discussed now in Parliament to change the organ donation default. And, well, perhaps it will pass, even though we are in opposition. So the student finance. In the Netherlands, you used to get money if you're a student to be able to live, not having to work while you're at university. And that may change into a student loan. So let's say you have finished your studies and you do nothing. Then you will continue receiving the money, but now it's a loan. It's not a gift, it's a loan. You are actually not entitled to it. But if you don't actively go somewhere, and here is written, you have to log in, stop it, etc., etc. So imagine that you are employed and you leave the company and they continue paying your wage. But now it's not a wage, but it's a loan. And you have actively to do something to stop it. So I asked, why don't they change the default? And the answer was, it's very easy. We have all explained what they should do. Same for the student travel product. Students in the Netherlands can travel free with a pass. But when they stop being a student, of course, they are not entitled anymore. And they don't make that pass invalid, like you can do in a hotel when you need to check out, you cannot enter your room anymore. Technology is available. They don't do it. Students have to go actively. So you will be charged 97 euros per half calendar month. Now, tens of thousands of students get a fine. Every year. Here too, if you say, but why don't you change it? The answer is, well, we have explained how they should do it. I was talking about the default of meat being served at dinners. So our government makes a lot of fuss about using less water in the house. And you know, in the hotels they say, please sleep on your pillow for many nights in order to save water, which of course we all should do. But see here, what is the percentage of the water we actually use as consumers? The water in our homes is 1% of total. It's the water we can see dripping, but most of the water, our water footprint, lies elsewhere, lies in our consumption. Talking about the cans, the David Halpern was talking about. For 1 can of soft drink, to produce it, you need 100 cans of water because of the sugar, making the sugar. Well, you see here meat, 24%. So even if we shouldn't wash ourselves anymore, at all, and neither our clothes, it should be only a fraction. Okay, so my worries. Is the attention for behavioral merely lip service? Do people at the ministries like to do all kinds of pilots to see whether things are effective, while we already have a lot of evidence of the power of defaults, and they could easily change it, like with the student loans, for example? Is it focusing merely on what the government wants people to do? For me, behavioral economics, as I call it, behavioral science, makes clear that even well-informed people make decisions that are not in line with their own preferences. That's also important, at least as important as making government policy more effective for the goals that the government has itself. But also worry, I never see, I don't know how that is in the UK, any attention for commitment mechanisms, helping people to make decisions in line with their preferences, like dieting, smoking, exercising. And I also see no attention at all for gender in the Dutch behavioral economics world at among policymakers. Now, for gender, some words on the research I am doing, because I'm also a professor. Do you realize that we find it normal to say building your portfolio, sorry for the typo, when it comes to pension savings, for example, and not knitting or cooking your portfolio? You laugh, so that's evidence, I think, that it's not neutral. So I'm working now with linguists. In linguistics, there's a concept, the concept of metaphor. A metaphor is an expression, a word or combination thereof, which tries to make a topic from an abstract domain, like saving, investing, more vivid by using a word, an expression from a concrete domain, building. Bricks, it's making a building. And I'm now doing research into the possible non-neutrality of metaphors in financial language. Could it, for example, explain the gender differences in financial attitudes and behavior? So here are some well-known metaphors. Level playing field, that's from, in economics, that's from competitive play. Beating the market, I mean, you're not really beating the market. Building, target, strategy, it all comes from masculine source domains. And we know that metaphor creates imagery, imagery creates effect, positive or negative effect. Positive effect reduces risk perception and increases return expectation, and for negative effect, it's the opposite. And we wonder, do metaphors in financial communication generate different effect among men and women, and may therefore contribute to explaining the gender bias in financial decision making? Thank you for your attention.
So we are running over, but with such a terrific panel, I've been granted an exemption of a few minutes. I'd like to ask one quick question myself, and then we'll take questions from the audience. On the issue of manipulation, where there is a very clear consensus of what we should be trying to achieve, people should pay their taxes, people should not collect benefits they're not legally entitled to, and so on. It seems to me more straightforward to nudge people into following those behaviors. What happens when we get to cases where it's less clear what the right behavior is? For example, David, you mentioned the fact that with low interest rates, people still aren't spending. Significant parts of governments around the world are trying to get people to spend more. Bill Congdon is working very hard to get people to save more. So you talk about dietary issues. Advice about diets has changed a lot over the course of my lifetime. How much meat should we eat? So as you think about behavioral interventions, nudges, in areas where the right outcome is less clear, how do you proceed? Who do you think should get to decide what the outcome is we're aiming for, and how do you implement that?
Can I?
Yes, please.
Well, what you are saying presupposes that if you don't actively do something, you offer choices in a neutral manner. And we know that that's not the case. I think that the word nudging sets people who are not very versed in the literature on a different footing, because perhaps you should use de-bias or neutralize or something. Because if I want to go there and everything surrounding me pulls me there, so that would be my first response. I don't know. The others?
Yeah, I mean, just, sorry, on, obviously that's, you know, I mean, on diet it's not neutral at all. I mean, in the UK, there's 10 times more advertising spend on confectionery and some fast foods than there is on fruit and vegetables, pasta, you know, it's like, it's not even. So some of your points also bear on, there's an issue about what's the right policy to pursue, what's the right advice, is it less sugar or whatever, we can have a discussion. Because that applies to all policy. Are you betting on the right thing? Have you got your causal account right? But the additional thing is, you know, for us, you know, we serve democratically elected governments, so we're going to do stuff anyway, often spend vast amounts of money, impose laws and so on along those same lines. Why don't we try and make sure we're choosing something which is in fact effective in the delivery of that policy? And ideally, if it is choice enhancing, or at least not choice restricting, and we're not saying on, for example, using an added sugar tax, you can still go and get certain drinks. It's just, you know, we think that it'll reshape the market in pretty helpful ways. But still, I think there is a point about nudging the nudges. My own view has long been it's really important that governments consult, be open about it. And even trials themselves, to me, they're not just a test of efficacy, they're also a test of acceptability. That's one of the most powerful elements.
Yeah, I'd make 2 quick points. And the first echoes David's point. Echo, did I say echo? And I really learned this from David when he came and spoke at the World Bank, actually. I think that all behavioral insights interventions need to be disclosed, discussed, and deliberated upon, just like any other policy. And the quality of that deliberation is as good as the democracy in the country, same as anything else. The second point is that development in some ways is a project with defined goals. We want people to be less poor, we want people to live longer, we want people to, you know, have better livelihoods. And so there's a kind of basic human capabilities underlying this, the agenda, just like all development policies.
Thank you.
So agreeing with essentially all of that, I'd add, I think, 3 points. One is that I think it speaks to being careful about design, intervention and policy design. So where the evidence is more clear, maybe we can use defaults. Where it's less clear, maybe we should use active choices. And ask people to make a choice at all, but not nudge them in a particular direction. I think second, it does speak to you know, being good consumers of evidence for the basis of policy, as well as generating evidence in for the purposes of policy. So, you know, being realistic and critical about the sources of evidence that we're basing the advice on. And the third is, and I guess this is related to the design point, I think this is one of the frontiers that people have talked about yesterday and probably more today, is whether we can do a better job of targeting interventions, knowing based on, you know, existing administrative data, using machine learning techniques to nudge people in a more targeted way.
That's terrific. Thank you. Okay, questions from you all. What do you want to put to the panelists? Yes, please. There's a microphone coming.
Hi. Could you describe the first 3 steps that would be necessary to set up a behavioral insights team? You know, the 3 main ones, or the beginning, the first ones. If it's getting a budget, convincing the government, getting a champion, whatever.
I think getting the top of the ministry, for example, enthusiastic. That was the case in the Netherlands. I don't know how that was in the UK.
Yeah, political support, administrative support, some people who know what they're talking about in the right place. Pretty good place to start. Not always conditions met in some countries. I think there's a session maybe discussing some of this, but anyway, yeah, very good.
I would add, I think, that all is necessary. How you get there, I think, can work both ways. I think our experience was sort of generating the evidence that this will work led to the buy-in that we think will then help, you know, make this work better.
Okay, great. Other questions? Up there in the back. Yes, please. Could you stand up? Thank you.
Hi there, Wendy De La Rosa from the Common Sense Financial Decision Making Lab. I wanted to follow up on the question of active choice. So as we think about imposing a sugar tax, we know that it will shift behavior one way, shape, or form, but there's a wide range on how it will change behavior, especially for low-income communities. So I think about the cigarette tax in the United States. It has helped to reduce cigarette use, but within low-income communities, they actually have become addicted and haven't actually reduced their cigarette consumption, it now becomes an added tax on the poor. So how are you thinking about the sugar tax in this example?
A very key issue for us is substitute, but what can you substitute to? Is there availability? We're quite big believers in substitution as a behavioral change. So on tobacco, I think we've reached the point where we can't put prices up much more. It does work a bit, but it does have also some regressive effects. We've been big supporters, as many will know in the room, of electronic cigarettes in the UK, making them widely available precisely because they make available actually a cheaper and healthier alternative and are a very effective route. In fact, our estimate is 60% more effective to quitting smoking than other routes. In fact, e-cigarettes are now the dominant route to quitting smoking in the UK. So in relation to sugar tax and why in particular form we go, it is partly because there are very good alternatives. And people often themselves are not aware of or are sensitive to even the relative sugar levels. If you glimpse that graph very, very fast, you'll notice that there are significant differences, for example, between sugars levels in Fanta versus Tango or Sprite versus 7-Up. I mean, people don't really care, they're sort of shrouded. If we can get a shift, there's an alternative product which is available, it can work pretty well. And just a final point on that, even now in UK supermarkets certainly, if you go and buy the cheapest drinks, they're often in fact sugar-free because aspartame's cheaper. So anyway, there is a plausible alternative, so there's a good route, I think, where we think it can work.
Time for one more question. Sir, you have the honor.
My observation on many of this, the work that we've been doing over the last day is that we've been focusing very much on the choice architecture for individuals. But my proposal is that for policy, I think more of our time should be spent thinking about choice architecture for companies, food companies, etc., and also institutions. I think, Dave, you mentioned how a sugar tax is not just important in its impact on people buying, but on the decisions that firms come when they think about new products to roll out and in terms of reformulation. And I just wonder if you can have any comments on whether there's moves towards that direction rather than just focusing. I think there will be bias unconsciously on our part because we talk about human behavior. I think for policy-wise, institutional and corporate behavior is just as important.
Well, for companies, I think that actually without using the name behavioral economics, any marketing which uses tricks to make people consume more than they intend is behaviorally inspired. But you are asking, of course, are companies willing to use the same instruments to help people make decisions in line with their preferences? And I would say that if that reduces their profit, it will be difficult to do that without any regulation. But I'm not sure.
I very much agree. I think this is one of the points I was trying to push forward. Regulation is clearly one approach, but I think there are other approaches. People talk about what's called governance by indicators. Measuring the carbon footprint of different firms, looking at, we discussed yesterday, the gender pay gap disparity in firms. These kinds of indicators are a way to change behavior even without regulation. There may be other approaches as well.
So,
Okay. I'm sorry.
I was going to, because I think it's such an important point. I think that's right. If I might, at the risk of causing some offense, I think there's a tendency built into the literature, not least because of its North American origins, to think about the individual very strongly, right? And that's a very strong thing in some ways. But as Mike Norton mentioned yesterday, we need to combine it with lots of other disciplines. You need to have a wider account of behavioral influence. You've certainly got to be, we're interested in firm behavior and so on. In terms of your point earlier, how do we square the circle in terms of saving? We want to shift the pattern of expenditure, including we want firms to spend more on R&D and other kinds of activities and the investment pattern, not to sit in a bank account. So that concerns lots of people. We want firms to come forward with innovative products. That's where the solution will come from, not necessarily government per se. But also just one final point on this, which is that institutions themselves and firms are themselves very powerful channels for shaping behavior. They create persistent effects which influence us all the time. So we surely have to be interested in that. And we need to evolve and broaden this community to make sure we are able to give that wider account of behavior change, as well as giving a sophisticated, at the heart of it, account of individual behavior change too.
Okay, this has been terrific. I'm afraid we need to stop there. Please join me in thanking our panel, Henriette and David.
Good morning and welcome back to our second day of BX16. I take it as a good sign that so many of you came back. As you know, we do care about behavior, so voting with your feet is important. I hope you had an inspiring day, an interesting day yesterday. I certainly did, and have many takeaways from many different sessions. Today, we'll be moving more into implementation, into applications in different parts of the world, in different organizations, governmental organizations, NGOs, really around the globe. So it should be super interesting. And then we'll end the day today by stretching our minds a little bit and asking the question of what's next. So where's kind of the field going? What are some of the very big questions? Well, let me reflect for a moment on yesterday, on some of the insights that I think transpired in various different sessions. One of them was that we're moving beyond what works. We're moving beyond understanding how to nudge people or how to promote behavior change, although that's still a very important topic for us, clearly. And we might want to call this a psychology of nudging. So what kind of nudge works under what kind of circumstances? And I think that's going to be with us as long as we exist as behavioral scientists. But I saw a few additional themes emerge yesterday. And one of them was the sustainability of nudging. That sometimes you want to nudge for tomorrow, but more now, then you'll have a break. Then we'll go into the breakout sessions, the ones that you signed up for. Then we'll have lunch, and then we'll tell you more about the afternoon. But we'll have more breakout sessions in the afternoon, and at the end, another panel discussions thinking about kind of the future of our field. And with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our moderator today, who joined us specifically for this session because it's actually very close to his heart, because he has been living at the intersection of academia and practice really all his life. And this is the Dean of the Kennedy School, Doug Elmendorf. So thank you very much, Doug, for being here. Doug is an economist, and he joined the Kennedy School from the Congressional Budget Office, where he was the director for 7 or 8 years. But Doug has really been a spanner. He's worked for Brookings, he's been on the faculty at Harvard University, he's worked for the Council of Economic Advisors, he's worked for the Treasury, for the Federal Reserve Bank. So lots of areas where we have a very close link between academia and practice. And thus we're super delighted, Doug, that you're here to have with us this discussion, which is so close to all of our hearts. Doug Elmendorf, thank you very much.
Thank you, Iris. I'm delighted to be here. One of the great rewards for me as Dean of the Kennedy School is having a chance to participate, at least a little, in the fascinating work of my colleagues.
Yesterday. You might have noted that a little bit of design also went in yesterday's day. And there's two things that we thought about. The first one was long breaks to encourage interactions and also to encourage participation in the sessions. And I think the weather wasn't completely collaborating there. So that I think was one thing that we were quite happy with, that many of you in fact talked to people that you hadn't talked with beforehand. And the other design element on which we're still collecting data, and this is of course very scientific, is the preview of these breakout sessions. Because when we thought about the previews of the breakout sessions, of course we had two things in mind. One was information sharing is good. Secondly, information sharing is bad because you'll all be in the lost domain for the rest of the day. Because now you're all thinking about all the great sessions that you're not part of. And it seems like most of you didn't feel extremely loss averse yesterday, but again, this is not a scientific experiment. The people who talk to us kind of like the previews here. And you can, of course, watch the breakouts, those sessions that you weren't able to attend after the conference. But in any case, any feedback that you have on some of these format questions and some of these previews, whether that was useful or not, we'd love to hear them. Today, we're doing a bit more of a standard format where we don't do previews of breakout sessions, just because we're hedging our bets. So we're going to do one day a bit more risky and then the other day a bit more traditional. But today, we'll go directly into your breakouts. So we'll have the panel. More often than not, we want to nudge for eternity. And I think that's a big question for us collectively, to think about which nudges are actually able to promote sustainable behavior change. So I think that was a big theme that really ran through many of the sessions yesterday. A second big theme was to better understand the context of nudging. So under what circumstances are these behavioral types of interventions particularly useful? Is it in circumstances, for example, where we have little power over the organizations or the people who we want to nudge? But people also thought about the right timing of nudges. So should we nudge at the first day of the month when we know behavior change is more likely, the first day of the week, the first day of the year? So this was in the health session, so really interesting insights there. So the timing was a second kind of concern of ours. And then thirdly, people started to wonder about the relative effectiveness of nudges compared to other kinds of interventions that we could think about. And the second bucket, kind of in contrast maybe to the first one, which is focusing on the how, the second bucket might be closer to the economics of nudging. Now really starting to think about what are the benefits and costs of nudges, what are the comparative advantage of a nudge compared to regulation or a law or an incentive. And some of you have started to look at cost effectiveness. So if you had $1 to spend to promote health behavior or to get more kids to school, what should we spend the dollar on? And then thirdly, and I think that's kind of where some of the boundaries really are right now, because these are really big questions and important questions, but close to the heart in particular of an economist, are questions around welfare. So we're not just promoting behavior change, but we are doing something bigger. What is the bigger impact of the change that we are promoting? How does it actually affect people's welfare or society's welfare? And of course, that itself is a behavioral question because of the debate around how we measure welfare to start with. So these are kind of three, I think, of the burning issues at the moment, kind of in addition to the how, just really thinking about kind of context and also cost effectiveness and welfare. So today, we want to shift the discussion and really hear from the decision makers who, some of them are also producers of research, of course, so that boundary is really blurry, but are also implementers and change makers in the real world outside of academia. And I think the fun part about our field of behavioral science is that much is co-production, that a lot of what we do, we academics, we do jointly with the practitioners and vice versa, and it's a back and forth. And I think that makes our product so much better. So I'm super excited about the panel that we have this morning, and I'm going to introduce our moderator in just a second. But I wanted to quickly preview the day today, give you a sense of where we're going, and also, in fact, reflect a little bit on the format